In the turbulent period where Anglo-Saxon England was at the height of the Viking invasions to its shores, women did not feature strongly in the histories being woven by famous monks in monasteries. But one Anglo-Saxon woman would rise to become not only a hero of the Kingdom of Mercia, but a legend amongst her own people, Aethelflaed. Born sometime around 870, Aethelflaed was the eldest child of Alfred the Great and his wife, Ealhswith. As a daughter, she was very far down the line of succession, if counted at all for it. Her name was made up of the prefix Ethel, which suggested royalty or nobility, but the meaning of fled is not so certain. There is suggestion it could mean beauty or flood, as in overflowing with nobility. Her father had never been intended for the throne as the youngest of 4 sons, but his reign saw some of the largest and most lasting administrative and military reforms of the early Middle Ages. Not much is known about Aethelflaed's childhood, but when she was born, her father was still an Aetheling. This was not merely a prince, but it indicated someone noble who was a prospective heir to the throne of an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. While she was still a toddler, Alfred was voted in by the Witan, the Council of Wessex, as ruler of their kingdom. His brothers did have sons, but in the Anglo-Saxon era, it was the heir with the most military experience and political savvy that would win out. It's likely that Aethelflaed saw little of her father, busy with official business and wars, and more likely that she spent most of her time with her mother, other noblewomen and their maids. Her education, if thought of at all, would not have included the military training of her brother. Young noble girls may have been taught to read and write, but probably not until they were at least 8 or 9 with a tutor. Before this, her mother was most likely to have taken charge of teaching some rudimentary reading skills. Reading and writing were seen as useful skills for a cleric, but not royalty. Her younger brother Edward was born sometime before 875, the future King of Wessex after their father, as well as their sister Aethelgifu. But it's not to say Aethelflaed and her siblings didn't have fun. Aethelflaed may have had dolls made from wood or little scraps of fabric and straw. Board games were popular with adults, so may have interested children, and there are accounts of children wrestling and playing outside together. When Aethelflaed was just 8 years old, on Twelfth Night 878, Alfred and his family were forced to flee Chippenham, where they had settled for the winter. The popular story is that the Vikings attacked the well-guarded fortification in the darkness, taking its occupants by surprise, and the royal family fled. But a newer theory has been suggested that in fact Alfred's nobles were tired of fighting against the Danes and never winning, and tired of how much money it was costing the kingdom. This meant they may well have decided to hand Alfred over to Guthrum in exchange for peace, and getting wind of this, the family escaped first with a small number of soldiers. Whatever the reason, Alfred, Aethelflaed and the rest of their family went into hiding along the marshlands of the east and west of the kingdom. In a reversal of roles, Alfred and his men became the raiders, while the Vikings settled into Wessex, taking necessary supplies by night and attacking small Danish parties of soldiers by day. Aethelflaed would have taken note of this, understanding perhaps that her father was sending a message that he was not dead or gone, but that the fight for his kingdom would continue even if it was on a smaller scale. In March of that year, they set up a base at Athelney with the aid of the ealdorman of Dorset, Aethelnoth. And so in late spring, after meeting with several armed inhabitants of Hampshire, Wiltshire and Somerset, her father won a decisive victory at the Battle of Eddington in 878, marking an agreement between Anglo-Saxon territory and the Viking-ruled Danelaw. In the same year, Alfred also oversaw the baptism of the Viking army's leader Guthrum, who took the name Aethelstan. Alfred was shrewd and set up his former enemy as King of East Anglia, recognising that this would help to protect Wessex's eastern border. These were events that Aethelflaed no doubt took a great deal of notice of, like everyone else, and they certainly shaped her own confident decisions as a leader in later life. Aethelflaed had been given some important lessons: never to surrender your rightful throne, that good relations with the ealdormen and inhabitants of the kingdom were necessary, and that enemies could become allies. Aethelflaed and her family would have returned to one of their royal residences in Wessex. Alfred wasted no time in establishing his defensive system of burhs or boroughs, fortified settlements that were either built from scratch or fashioned from existing structures panning out across Wessex. These were designed to protect people and livestock during Viking raids, as well as giving military forces a highly protected fortress from which to defend. It would have been around this time in the mid-880s that Alfred met the new Mercian overlord Aethelred. Aethelflaed herself would have been around 10 years old when the building works began. So once her father met Aethelred, it's likely she was in her early teens. Her education also would have continued at this point in the relative calm of peace. Although Alfred did not learn Latin until his 40s, he would have been literate in his mother tongue, and there are references to him enjoying the Old English tales, including those of his family's supposed legendary ancestry, which included Odin. No doubt Aethelflaed would have been encouraged not only to learn to read these, but to learn them by memory in a culture that still held a large oral tradition. Royal children would also have been expected to learn good manners. While there are no direct references to what Aethelflaed and her siblings would have been taught, there are references by Asa, a Welsh monk who became a bishop in the 890s, to Alfred giving them virtuous instruction. And other writings nearly a century later suggest noble children should be taught how to be kind, pious, loyal, and just. Young girls such as Aethelflaed would also have to learn how to weave and sew, no matter their position in society. Even a noblewoman would be expected to be able to create some fine cloth or tapestries. As a teenager, Aethelflaed would also have been expected to prepare herself for being a royal bride. In the Anglo-Saxon period, royal women would hold influence over their court, but they were still subordinate to their husband. Royal wives were expected to be good hosts, good mothers, and to be adorned with jewels and finery to show their regal station. Around 886, Alfred took London, restoring its freedom, or reverting it back to Saxon hands. It was around this time that her father also changed his title from King of the West Saxons, as his ancestors had been termed, to King of the Anglo-Saxons. He claimed to rule over all people in areas not controlled by the Vikings. London was then almost immediately handed over to Lord Aethelred of Mercia. Londoners considered themselves Mercian, so perhaps that was the main reason. But there is also suggestion that it was a wedding gift. While we do not know the exact date of their marriage, Aethelflaed and Aethelred are commonly accepted as having been married in 886, when Aethelflaed would have been about 16. While we also don't know the exact age of Aethelred, judging backwards from his death, it has been proposed he was at least 10 years older than his new bride, but this was common in early medieval marriages. Aethelflaed was now no longer a child, and would have travelled to Mercia to begin life as a noble wife. Aethelred has in popular culture been represented as a distant or even outright abusive older husband, but this has fed from later romantic representations of Aethelflaed as a young princess who falls in love with another. He has also been shown in popular culture as a battle-shy weakling, when the truth was that Aethelred was an experienced warrior with leadership skills. The reality is that it was a political match, and neither would have expected a romantic relationship. Although Anglo-Saxon women were not equal to men, they were able to keep control over their own property and goods, and could even leave their husbands and take their children with them. For the 25 years Aethelflaed and Aethelred were married, the evidence available shows their relationship was one of mutual trust and respect. From the time of their marriage, Aethelflaed appears on charters alongside her husband. Unlike her own mother's status in Wessex, Aethelflaed was, as a Mercian royal consort, allowed to hold the title Queen, and was therefore more prominent in the political and administrative matters of court. Her husband had to be a loyal vassal to Wessex, and having Aethelflaed by his side must have helped. The couple lived across various estates in Mercia. It was normal for Anglo-Saxon rulers to move around their kingdoms in order to shore up protection or see that their citizens were behaving as they should. Eventually, however, the couple seemed to have settled on Gloucester as their capital, and mostly resided there. Aethelflaed and her husband poured their energy into a rebuilding programme, as Alfred had done, fortifying towns and villages and creating new burhs where necessary. The role of rulers of an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, however, also included giving, and in the 7th and 8th centuries, kings were described as ring givers or gold givers. The royal couple took this literally, giving generous donations to churches in Mercia. This culminated in their creation of a new minster in Gloucester, St. Oswald's Priory, in the 890s. It was designed to be an exact replica of the old minster in Winchester, the principal cathedral for Wessex. The priory was also originally dedicated to St. Peter, but in 909 an Anglo-Saxon raid into Danish territory led to the bones of St. Oswald being taken from Bardney Abbey in Lincolnshire and transferred to the Gloucester Minster, whereupon it was renamed for St. Oswald. This important church would also later become the final resting place for both Aethelflaed and Aethelred. But of course, this was not the only duty of a queen. Aethelflaed also had to become a mother. The royal couple are known to have had one child, a daughter named Elfwin. Her exact date of birth is also not known, but it is presumed she was born not long after her parents were married. There was no reason to delay having an heir. William of Malmesbury, a chronicler, later wrote that her birth was a difficult one, to the point that Aethelflaed abstained afterwards from sharing a bed with her husband to avoid further pregnancies. His is the only account to mention this, so we cannot be certain how true this was, especially as Aethelred was absent for a lot of their marriage on campaign and later was ill. The lack of further children could simply be down to bad timing. Other possibilities are simply that Aethelflaed was unable to conceive again, such as with Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor, or even that she did have other pregnancies that ended in stillbirths or miscarriages, which often went unrecorded in the early medieval period. We also do not know, during the 890s, when her husband was absent campaigning against Danish forces attacking the borders of Mercia, where Aethelflaed was. It is possible she was with him as a symbol of the united alliance between Mercia and Wessex, a show of unity to rally their Anglo-Saxon people against the invaders. Equally possible is that Aethelflaed was at home, managing the household. Unlike in later times, when this came to mean simply ordering servants around and organising dinners, Anglo-Saxon royal women were also expected to understand the economy of their kingdom and deal with matters pertaining to it, as well as understanding the judicial system and helping settle disputes between citizens. Aethelflaed would have been an accountant, a judge, and a hostess while being a queen. In her role as peace weaver, Aethelflaed would have needed to work well with her advisors, to understand when to listen and when to advise her own opinion. Women had to be careful to be resourceful and intelligent, but never step beyond the boundaries of what was considered womanly, such as Empress Matilda would do a few centuries later by attempting to take a male position as ruler of England. Aethelflaed also would have helped to take care of her young nephew Aethelstan, the future King of England. He is believed to have been an illegitimate son of her brother Edward, as his mother is unknown. At some point in the mid-890s, he was sent to the Mercian court to be brought up and educated with his aunt and uncle. It was in the next decade, at the beginning of the 10th century, that Aethelred's health began to decline. Aethelflaed seems to have stepped up and taken a bigger role in running his government at this time, although it is likely it still required the acceptance of her husband on larger matters. Some historians think this period of illness may have begun in 902, when Aethelflaed's name appears alone or in conjunction with her brother on military excursions in the Annals of Aethelflaed, a version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle told from a Mercian viewpoint. However, other records also show Aethelred still taking part in meetings with Edward, albeit with Aethelflaed by his side. As we do not know what illness he had, it's hard to say how involved he was. It is possible that Aethelred's illness was such that he became more incapacitated by it as time went on, but had good periods where he was able to take an active part in running his kingdom. What is known is that Aethelflaed's name appears more after this period, and she appears to be taking on military roles usually meant for a man. In 902, Ingimund the Dane and his men had been chased out of Ireland and Wales respectively, and ended up sailing along the Wirral Peninsula somewhere near Chester. When the Viking army came ashore, instead of fighting, Aethelflaed and Aethelred seem to have instead opted for talking things out. Ingimund, so the records say, came specifically to Aethelflaed to ask only for some land that he and his men could settle and build houses on. Using her father's example, Aethelflaed agreed to this, choosing diplomacy over war when her own forces would have been outmatched. This shows that Aethelflaed had proven herself willing to speak with dangerous foes in order to achieve peace, and that she was willing to take the risk in order to protect Mercia. Perhaps the hint of a thoughtful ruler who understood when to talk and when to act. But in 911, the double act of sharing duties between the royal couple came to an end, as Aethelred finally succumbed to his illness and died. When Anglo-Saxon rulers died, their crown did not automatically pass to their son as would happen in later centuries, but instead a new ruler was chosen by the Witan or council. Aethelflaed could have allowed the crown of Mercia to pass to one of her nobles, or even another member of her family, while retreating quietly to a nunnery for retirement. But after spending the majority of her life being politically and economically involved in the running of Mercia, she seems to have been unwilling to give it up. In Mercia's case, the Witan agreed that Aethelflaed would be their new ruler as Lady of the Mercians. This was one of the most unique events of the Anglo-Saxon period, but it can be understood in what was happening around Mercia. In the period Aethelred had died, a few years of peace had been rudely trampled on by Danes and Saxons once again trying to claim land from one another. Her brother Edward, now king of the West Saxons for over a decade since Alfred's death in 899, was riling things up by continuing his father's efforts to reclaim England under a Saxon crown. Mercia valued its independence and would not have been appreciated being swallowed up by Edward's rule. There was also Aethelstan, who in years to come would be readily accepted by Mercians as their king, but at the time was too young and inexperienced. Mercia was vulnerable, and armies passing through could ravage villages in their way. It needed strong leadership, and in view of uncertainties, a lady who had successfully ruled in her husband's stead, often alone for the last decade, and had headed military campaigns and brought peace between warring neighbours, must have seemed like a surprisingly strong candidate in a mostly patriarchal society. It helped that Aethelflaed was also half Mercian through her mother, and so could also claim lineage through her ancient Mercian ancestors. One of the first things that happened was that her brother King Edward reclaimed London and Oxford for the West Saxon crown. This has often been interpreted in popular fiction as an unpopular move, but in reality, the historical sources show nothing of any displeasure Aethelflaed may have had with this. It suggests that perhaps, with the death of Aethelred, Edward considered the agreement with which his father had handed them over to Mercian control null and void. Or it's even possible there was an agreement in place that on Aethelred's death, the cities would pass back to Wessex. Aethelflaed seems to have wisely considered the loss of the cities, which were expensive to man and protect, less important than the continued strong alliance between Mercia and Wessex. Finally able to rule independently, Aethelflaed wasted no time in flexing both her military and administrative muscles. She first began extending and shoring up the many fortifications her father had started, building defences in several places. Aethelflaed was ensuring her kingdom was well protected. In total, she restored no less than 9 fortresses in the space of 5 years. They were strategically placed as well. Chester, Shrewsbury, Bridgnorth, Worcester and the royal capital Gloucester all connected in a chain across Mercia, providing an unbroken line of defence. Once again, Aethelflaed, now at least in her late 30s, joined forces with Edward. Instead of merely defending, the siblings now changed tack and decided to attack the Danes surrounding them. Northumbria had no leader after the Battle of Tettenhall, leaving it open to attack and weakened, and protecting their kingdoms would be best done by attacking proactively against opportunists. There is a suggestion that this impressive building and military forethought by Aethelflaed may have actually inspired a poem. There is a poem called Judith, based on a story from the Apocrypha, one of the extra books of the Catholic Old Testament. While modern audiences would not recognise the Book of Judith, early medieval people would have, and Judith was a popular girl's name at the time. The main aspects of the eponymous poem's heroine Judith was that she was Jewish and that she was a war leader. There is suggestion that the poem was actually an allegory to Aethelflaed's own career as ruler. The story begins with ancient Israel beset on all sides by the pagan Assyrians, and so worn down with fighting are the people that they consider surrendering. The Anglo-Saxons no doubt saw the reflection of their own lands beset with pagan Danes. The Israelites decide to give it a few days and pray to God for a sign when Judith enters the scene. In the Bible, she is a widow. In the poem, a fair virgin. Judith is horrified at the idea of surrender and insists instead that she and her ladies will save everyone. Taking off her jewellery and fine clothes, the women enter the enemy camp. Once in, the men get drunk and Judith seduces the commander of the Persian army before proceeding to cut his head off when he falls asleep. Despite medieval norms of how a woman should behave, Judith was lauded as a divine bringer of God's justice. The parallels with Aethelflaed's own struggle with the Danes around her kingdom and her strength in overcoming this with her fortresses and battles is obvious. She was known as a very pious woman, and no doubt also seen as having God on her side. It should be understood that although a woman leading armed attack was unusual enough that chroniclers would comment on it, it wasn't so unusual that there were not other contemporaries or near contemporaries of Aethelflaed. Some examples would be Matilda of Tuscany over a century later, who apparently rode into battle in armour to defend the Pope's lands. Another would be Empress Matilda, the uncrowned first Queen of England who fought a war against Stephen I alongside her half-brother, or even the wife of her foe, Matilda of Boulogne, who led forces to rescue her husband when he was imprisoned. In the 10th century was Gerberga of Saxony, who led the defence of Leon when her husband was in prison, and later as regent for her son, went on campaign with him. So while Aethelflaed was in a position not normally held by women, it was accepted, provided her cause was deemed just, especially in the eyes of God, and if she had no other choice. There is no evidence that Aethelflaed had weapons training, but it's likely that in the precarious situation of her time, she may have requested some rudimentary understanding of how to use a shield at least. If she was riding out to troops to rally them, Aethelflaed would certainly have worn some armour for protection, and it's also possible she carried a short sword to signify her rank. Whether she knew how to use it is uncertain, but given her proactive interest in all other areas of her life, Aethelflaed again probably had some simple training on how to use a weapon, even if it was simply in defence of her own life. But she was highly unlikely to have ever fought on the battlefield. There are few, if any, references to women actually fighting in the heat of battle in the early medieval period. It's more likely Aethelflaed commanded her army from behind the front line, using intelligence and cunning to beat the enemy instead of muscles. But the highlight of Aethelflaed's military career would come in 917, when she sent an army to attack and capture the borough of Derby. This was part of Mercian lands, but was held in the Danelaw. It was part of the so-called 5 boroughs, made up of Derby itself, as well as Leicester, Nottingham, Stamford and Lincoln. Derby had, by this point, been under Danish rule for around 40 years, and the inhabitants showed no sign of being unhappy with this. They would have been children or grandchildren of the original Danish settlers. But it was close to Aethelflaed's newly fortified town of Stafford, and she may have seen it as a risk that the Danes would establish a base there to attack Mercia. For whatever reason, she appears to have thought it was necessary to strike first, and she attacked Derby. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that Aethelflaed fought with the help of God, further proof of her divine right to fight as ruler of Mercia. The account goes on to say that Derby gave fierce resistance, as might be expected of people who didn't ask to be liberated. Later accounts of the battle describe how there was much close quarters fighting, and 4 thanes close to Aethelflaed were slain within the gates. It was a slow, bloody battle, but eventually the great wooden gates to the city were burned down, allowing the Saxon soldiers to get inside and claim it for their queen. In a similar act to taking the bones of St. Oswald, Aethelflaed also took the bones of St. Alkmund, a local saint whose remains were taken instead to Shrewsbury. When Derby submitted to her, it was such a monumental victory that all the surrounding areas followed suit. It was an astounding moment for Aethelflaed, and so another incredible event occurred from this. The city of Leicester laid down their arms and submitted to Aethelflaed without even putting up a fight. A woman who was intended only to be a royal wife had broken two of the important cities in the Danelaw. But was it really this simple? Was Aethelflaed able to succeed where her brother Edward was apparently struggling? The chronicle, told from the Mercian point of view, pits Aethelflaed as a warrior queen striding through Danish cities with ease, while her brother struggled to capture them. But the truth is more nuanced. Aethelflaed had always preferred a diplomatic approach, and she had entered into talks with citizens in the area who were feeling uncertain about Viking control before her army ever reached Leicester's gates. In the summer of 918, Aethelflaed's influence seemed unstoppable when York, then known as Jorvik, made it known that they wanted to also offer their loyalty to Aethelflaed. This was led by Christian York citizens worried about the progress of pagan Vikings towards their city. It was, alongside her brother's victories, the last great Viking city to take before England once again came under united Anglo-Saxon rule. Lady Aethelflaed had ruled over her people and kingdom for 3 decades, had subdued large swathes of Dane-ruled England, sometimes by using nothing more than words, and had won the trust of a council of men, taking a position normally held for an experienced male leader with military battles behind him. Aethelflaed was at the height of her power, but sadly it came to an end too quickly. Before she could accept the offer from York, Aethelflaed died suddenly on the 12th of June 918. The greatest queen of the Anglo-Saxon era passed away at 48 years old, leaving a legacy of quiet strength and intelligent leadership behind her. She was buried next to her husband at the minster they had founded together at St. Oswald's in Gloucester. After she passed, the Mercian version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that her daughter Elfwin succeeded her as Lady of Mercia. It should be noted that the West Saxon version of the Chronicle does not mention her in this capacity, so we don't actually know how true this is. If Elfwin did succeed her mother, it would show the trust and belief the Mercians had in the daughter of Aethelflaed. But somewhere between December 918 and the end of 919, Edward took Mercia under West Saxon rule, and Elfwin disappeared somewhere into Wessex. In years to come after Edward's death, his possibly illegitimate son Aethelstan would take his crown, becoming the first king of a united England. Brought up in his aunt's court, he was instantly accepted by the Mercians as their king, and his bloodline convinced Wessex. Following the example of his grandfather, father and aunt, he would leave behind more legal documents than any other Anglo-Saxon king, and he would reform the judicial system of England. As Aethelflaed before him had done, Aethelstan would also found numerous churches, and his household became a centre of learning. Aethelflaed didn't live to see England united as a single country, but her rule, alongside her brothers, helped shape the form of it and its structure for the rest of the medieval period. The Lady of the Mercians left her mark as a warrior, a strategist, and an educated woman who truly deserved the title Queen. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.